podcast the other week or a couple of weeks ago talking about Ozempic, so it's all fresh in my mind.
All ready to go. Well, welcome back to the show, Lucas. I think this puts you in rarefied air three times on Future Squared. I think the only other guest I've had on three times is Tim Harford, who is like a New York Times best-selling author of multiple books. I don't know. Take that as a compliment.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. I'm pumped to be back, and I've always got some new, fresh ideas to share. So yeah, it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, looking forward to it, mate. And I think today, I mean, we're here to talk all about Ozempic, but before we dive into that topic, I'd love to just shed some light on obesity statistics,
Mm.
especially over the past 40 or so years. So back in 1980, about 15% of Americans were obese. And today that number is 42%. More than
Jeez.
70% of all Americans are either overweight or obese today. And this trend has been replicated both in Britain, Australia, basically all Western countries. Now, why is this happening? Like, what's precluded this massive growth in obesity rates across the Western world, Lucas?
Well, as a population, as a whole, we're definitely getting a lot sicker and unhealthier. And so, really, if we look at the main culprits behind the obesity epidemic, a lot of it would be due to like sedentary behaviors, lack of physical activity. That's going to be a big factor. Just really shitty diets, like selecting the wrong foods and going for highly palatable foods, selecting foods that taste nice,
Hmm.
is the common issue that people face. And that sort of like instant gratification, like immediately searching for things that they want in the moment to get that dopamine hit. I also blame social media as well. I definitely think that like social media use, like there are young adults and teenagers that are like fully glued to their phones to the point where they're just like not even interested in going outside to do like to play sports or
Hmm.
things like that. So realistically, there are many different factors contributing to the obesity crisis that we're in, and that's brought the rise of new medications to treat obesity, of
Hmm.
which we're talking about today, which is one of them, which is Ozempic. But yeah, there's many different factors, Stevie. Like there's a
Yeah.
number of factors there.
So I mean, apart from that, so social media more or less came along with, MySpace and Friendster around the mid to late 2000s and really took off with Facebook around 2011 and shortly thereafter Instagram. But this food epidemic or this overweight uh, epidemic of sorts has been going since the 1980s. So from between 1980 and 2000, there was a massive surge. And some experts say that big food had a lot to do with this. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that about 50 years ago, big food lobbied, uh, you know, scientists essentially to put out studies that essentially found fat to be the culprit. And as a result of that, they could flood our supermarket shelves with products like cereals that were fat free, 99% fat free, but absolutely loaded to the hilt with sugar. I mean,
Yeah.
how much has that played a role in this epidemic?
Well, it's definitely contributing. I mean, if we look at the confusion that lies in just the general population when they go into a supermarket, they're identifying different foods and trying to understand like food labels. A lot of the time, you'll see that like 5-star health rating that they put
Hmm.
on different foods,
Yeah.
which is completely corrupt in my opinion.
Why is it corrupt?
Well, because I've seen scenarios where there are foods in my opinion, having studied naturopathy and been in the nutrition space for over 7 years, certain foods that they're labeling as like a 2-star rating, and obviously 5-star being the highest rating and 2-star being sort of low. Um, there is no good rationale to list it as such a low rating. Like there really isn't any sort of legitimate research or evidence to back that
So
rating, you know?
what kinds of foods might they list as, say, two-star rating that should receive a much higher rating in your view?
I've seen scenarios where they've rated like turkey breast, like chicken mince,
Yeah.
uh, sometimes even like steak.
Uh-huh.
It's like, really low ratings, sometimes even like yogurt, low fat milks, things like that.
Yeah.
That's yeah, and it's just like as a consumer, like if you're completely brainwashed, you'll sort of, fall victim to that and then just select a product that is possibly like 5 star, which has
Mm.
like a shitload of sugar in there.
Yeah. It's kind of like how up until about 10 years ago, eggs were demonized as, they're going to give you cholesterol, you shouldn't eat too many eggs, and so on and so forth. And nowadays, I think it was the Weight Watchers food chart. They basically listed eggs as like a 0 point food, which essentially means you can eat as many of them as you want without having to worry too much about
Mm.
your weight or your health. It's funny how that sort of we've come 180 as far as eggs are concerned, but also as far as fat is concerned. Like like I was saying earlier, fat has been demonized, but now more and more people are waking up to the fact that most fats are actually not only good for you, but necessary as part of a balanced diet.
Yeah, I want to sort of outline the different types of fats for
Hmm.
your audience. That's really important. Um, so what's happened is we're seeing an explosion in the use of these polyunsaturated fatty acids. So they're called PUFAs, and they consist of vegetable oils. So
Hmm.
like canola oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, otherwise and canola oil is also known as rapeseed oil.
Yeah.
Um, these different vegetable oils, they're very prone to something called oxidation, which means that they're highly unstable, and when they're oxidized in the human body, they can cause collateral damage to different organs and tissues. If we look at the another type of fat, which is the saturated fats, which are purely animal based and also like coconuts. Um, a lot of the research on saturated fats will be like pretty much bashing them and saying that they're, the likely culprit behind cardiovascular disease um, and and different sort of health issues. And then we have another type of fat, which is the monounsaturated fat. So these include avocados, macadamias, the stuff that you love, Stevie,
Hmm.
almonds,
The
that's those sort of
ABCs,
fats.
the almonds, Brazil nuts, and cashews. Love it.
Love it. The ABC spread, gotta love that. Um, and they're rich in like these nuts are typically rich in these monounsaturated fats. Now, if we were to rank which ones are best,
Hmm.
well, these monounsaturated fats are the most optimal, in my opinion. So that includes avocados, nuts, olive oil. Um, yeah. Then we're looking at saturated fats, so like butter, milk, meat, you know, those sort of things. And then try not to consume polyunsaturated fats because these fats are the ones that are actually causing cellular insulin resistance,
Hmm.
and causing damage to other organs and tissues. So it's
So,
just
so,
a
so for our audience, sorry, Lucas, who may not be aware what insulin resistance does, like what are some of
yep.
the outcomes of that?
Yep. Yep. So one way to know whether or not you're insulin resistant would be if you eat a big bowl of pasta or
Hmm.
rice and you feel like lethargic or really, really sluggish 2 hours after eating,
Hmm.
there's a pretty good chance that you can't properly metabolize carbohydrates.
Right.
So what happens there is that you get a massive blood sugar spike, and then your body basically shits itself. It's like not sure how to handle the sugar floating in the bloodstream, because really the goal is we don't want sugar to be elevated in the bloodstream. We want sugar to be deposited into our bank accounts, which is like muscle and liver. So we
Hmm.
want the carbohydrates to be deposited, and if you have good insulin sensitivity, then you're very able to metabolize. You're much better at metabolizing carbohydrates as a fuel source.
Right. And so another byproduct of that might be that you just feel hungrier more often because you have
Mhm.
that spike and that crash, and then an hour later, after you consume that rice, you're hungry again, so you eat again, and so you just end up consuming a lot more calories and essentially putting on more weight.
Exactly. Yeah, they go through that sort of roller coaster. They feel really hungry 2 to 3 hours after eating, and they also tend to have like a sweet tooth, so to speak.
Mhm.
And also they'll oftentimes both in women as well, they'll get like really bad hormonal issues, things like PCOS, endometriosis, things like that as well.
Yeah. And you can, from what I've read, lower the resistance of carby foods by, going for a walk half an hour after consuming, say, carbs, or dousing your food in, say, acidic juices, say like lemon
Mhm.
juice or vinegar and things of that sort. I've read that that can reduce the GI spike by, upwards of 50% in some cases.
Yeah, so that's a really good practical takeaway for those listening in is if you know that you're about to have a high carb meal, you can actually be proactive about it and you can actually do some things to offset the damage or make your body like better able to tolerate the spike. Number one is what you said. You can definitely go for like a 10 to 15-minute walk after a meal, which for most people that feels awesome because you
Mhm.
feel like you're getting better digestion. If you wear a glucose monitor, like a CGM device you put on the back of your arm, you can actually track that and see that your blood sugar doesn't actually spike as high when you're going for a walk. Second to that is we can actually incorporate really old school remedy, which is like stood the test of time, which is apple cider vinegar. So apple cider vinegar, like about a teaspoon mixed in with a bit of water before the meal, not after or not during, like preloading
Mhm.
before the meal, can actually delay the release of carbohydrate, like sugar into the bloodstream as well.
Yeah. And just circling back to the different types of fat, Lucas, you did mention, PUFAs, mono, unsaturated, and saturated fats, but what about trans fats?
Okay.
What are trans fats?
Yeah, so that's the it's funny because I neglected that category because I don't speak to the people that I surround myself with don't even like it's like a no-go zone. So we
Yeah.
none of us ever even really eat that. I'm in my own bubble that you joke about all the time. Um, so these trans fats includes like things like cakes, pastries, biscuits, basically like just the really bad types of fats.
Hmm.
And you want to be like McDonald's, like just really, really bad for you. It's like the worst. Like your body has a very hard time at dealing with these trans fats like
Mm.
safely.
Yeah. And what are some of the sort of negative consequences of consuming too many trans fats?
I mean, definitely like the obesity, driving up obesity, causing weight gain, causing hormonal disruption.
Hmm.
That's a big one, like lowering testosterone levels in men and driving insulin resistance in women. And we're also going to see like body-wide, like inflammation. Maybe you feel like you struggle to recover after workouts. You're just
Yeah.
constantly inflamed. That could also play a role as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. And as I said earlier, we're here to talk about Ozempic. And interestingly, during COVID, during lockdowns, a lot of people came out of that period, 2020, 2021, with a few extra kilos around their waist, carrying an extra tire in some cases. But Hollywood celebrities oftentimes came out of lockdown looking as good as they did before, if not slimmer. Now, some of them used to credit Pilates for this, others were crediting some new fad diet. But the real reason for a lot of them was, in fact, Ozempic. At a high
Yeah.
level, is Lucas, what is Ozempic and how does it work?
All right. So Ozempic is the generic name, like the trade name for a drug that's called
Hmm.
semaglutide.
Yep.
Now, the drug was initially developed to treat type 2 diabetes because it
Hmm.
helps to lower blood sugar levels. Now, one of the one of the effects that Ozempic can have on someone is that it can massively suppress appetite,
Hmm.
and it can do it both centrally and peripherally. So, like, it actually blocks the body's desire for all sorts of foods. Now, this is going to be really, really beneficial for morbidly obese individuals who literally have hit the point where they're like 150 kilos, like, they're really at the cusp of like complete mortality. So that sort of classification of individuals can benefit greatly from
Hmm.
Ozempic. But what it actually does, Steve, is it can actually like freeze the stomach as well. So what can happen is when people inject Ozempic, part of its appetite suppression of effects means that it stops gastric emptying, so it delays gastric emptying or stomach emptying,
Hmm.
and it can cause something known as gastroparesis, which means it literally can freeze the stomach and cause food to no longer actually pass down into the small intestine, keeping you fuller for longer. So the drug is very effective at dropping body fat, without a doubt. Like it's
Yeah.
going to help with weight loss. And the key word there is weight loss, like weight loss, not necessarily fat loss.
Yeah. It
Because
includes muscle loss, which we'll get
yeah,
into later in today's conversation. But essentially, what I'm hearing is if you are, say, overweight or in fact morbidly obese, that's a pretty big range um, of people there. Someone could be 10 kilos overweight to say 100 kilos overweight in the morbidly obese category. There are indeed benefits. And when we look at, say, similar modalities, for example, bariatric surgery, so lap band surgery, I came across a study that basically looked at 15,000 people and essentially their risk of, so these were bariatric surgery patients who were previously chronically overweight. Now, their chance of dying from diabetes fell by 92% after the surgery. Their chance of dying by cancer fell by 60% and coronary heart disease by 56%. So, for people who have a difficult time losing weight, maybe they've tried exercising, maybe they've tried eating well, maybe they have thyroid issues that are preventing them from losing that weight. Would you say that the benefits of taking Ozempic outweigh some of those side effects, such as, say, muscle loss, for example, or freezing the stomach that you pointed to a moment ago?
I think there's a subset of the population that can indeed benefit from like Ozempic, and it can actually reduce the burden on the actual medical system in the long run, because we're having less like really morbidly obese individuals going into hospital for, fat, like obesity related complications. So I think it's a tool, just like we have like with big pharma. I mean, my dad's a pharmacist. I've shared this on the podcast
Hmm.
before. Um, just like we see with big pharma, there's a time and place for these medications, but it's when they're used under the wrong conditions, that's when we're going to really start to see complications and like issues arise. And like, is the individual really getting to the root cause of their obesity issue? And like the question also then remains, is the individual then dependent upon this drug for the rest of their life? Because what happens when they stop the drug? Because when they stop, the rebound weight gain is like almost 95% of cases. In fact, most individuals regain even more weight after
Yeah.
they come off.
And yeah, and that's exactly what I've read as well, that Ozempic isn't something you take once. You have to take it pretty much for your entire life. And currently it's not cheap. It's about $800, 800 US dollars a month. Of course,
Mm.
those patents, that copyright ends around 2032. So you can imagine by 2032, there'd be a lot of generic knockoffs flooding the market for maybe $40 a pop. But is there also, say, with any drug, the more you take it, the more you develop a tolerance. So while the price might come down, people might find that they'll need to take more and more of, semaglutide, Ozempic, whatever name you want to use, in order to, feel satiated for longer.
So there is some reports about like potential tolerance buildup and needing to constantly titrate the dosage up, of
Hmm.
which if you keep titrating the dosage up, then you're going to probably run into more side effects and complications. So it is going to be something where the individual needs to be carefully monitored by their doctor and work closely with them. Um, yeah, it's definitely something that like I know of a number of individuals that I've personally consulted that when they were on it, they definitely lost a lot of weight and
Mm,
they were like feeling a lot better. But when they stopped, they really struck like their appetite came back like multiplier, like it's
yeah.
coming back where you're ravenous.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think that's a similar thing you see with a lot of diets or people that lose a lot of weight for a while. Eventually, something happens. Maybe it's some sort of life event, or maybe it's a physiological thing. But oftentimes, we see people lose weight for a while and then just pile it all back on. Are there any
Mm.
sort of reasons for that sort of phenomena? Because, some of the research I've seen on diet is people will lose weight, but then 2 years later, they're within a few pounds of where they started? Like, is there a baseline that our bodies are trying to kind of push us back towards?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good question whether or not like the body has a set point, everyone's unique set point of their body weight. I think the rebound weight gain that occurs with like these GLP-1 agonists, these drugs, is
Hmm.
I think heavily mediated by appetite dysregulation that happens after you're coming off. Like, I mean, it's going to be really hard to, if you've got really bad eating habits, then your inability to regulate appetite post Ozempic, you basically think about it like this: like let's say you have dinner, you've had like chicken and rice and some veggies. Let's say just a standard meal, chicken, rice, and veggies, but you're still hungry. Most people are not going to just go for more chicken. They're going to probably go for like some desserts, sweets, some other stuff later on,
Yeah.
and their bad habits just kick right back in.
Yeah, yeah. So it requires a lot of willpower, which in certain circumstances is really hard to get a grip on, particularly if you're going out late at night with your friends and they're all eating and drinking, and maybe you've had a few drinks yourself. And so your ability to control your desires tapers off, and it's easy to then reach for that cupcake and that coffee scroll or whatever it is, whatever's on the buffet table at a particular establishment. But the benefits, I think, as far as health is concerned, we've covered some of those, but then there's also some of the less quantifiable things. Obviously, confidence, self-esteem, self-respect, access to more opportunities, job opportunities, dating partners, mating partners, like the list goes on, providing someone can keep that weight at a manageable level, which, as we've said, can be a challenge for a lot of people. But I guess there's a whole bunch of risks. We've touched on a couple, one of which I wanted to double click on, which was muscle loss. So
Mm.
it seems to me that Ozempic can cause people to lose something like 20 to 30% of lean muscle mass, which is not insignificant.
Well, this is a no, this is a side effect that they don't really discuss, and that is like the fact that, yeah, weight loss is a bit of a blanket term. Fat loss is more specifically what we want to target, but
Hmm.
muscle loss is not something we want to be losing as we age. In fact, muscle mass is going to be absolutely essential for longevity and living long. There's multiple studies demonstrating that having muscle mass is actually key to longevity. Peter Attia has spoken about this.
Hmm.
Huberman, Rhonda Patrick, they all talk about this prolifically. And so anything
Peter
we can,
Attia, sorry, Lucas. Peter Attia, I think, says if there's one thing you can focus on to live a long, healthy life, it's muscle, like
yeah,
maintaining muscle mass. And in fact, he argued against fasting because he said that it can actually come at a cost to your muscle mass and that both of them have longevity benefits. But if you had to pick one over the other, he's like, go with the muscle mass. So if that means you have to eat more often in order to, recover from a workout, do that. Don't fast for 16 hours if it means that you're going to lose muscle mass. Like real quickly, just on that, where do you sit?
I'm pretty similar. I think there's a certain, like again, a certain subset of the population that can like benefit from fasting, like i.e. metabolically healthy individuals like yourself who actually have the discipline. Like when you break your fast, you're not just smashing like a like a cheat, like a heavy cheat meal where you're
Yeah, like a
just like
large capricciosa pizza.
so like you actually have that. So there's certain people, like maybe even some athletes, where they've got good blood sugar control, they can probably do that. But between like muscle mass and VO2 max,
Hmm.
like which is your aerobic conditioning, actually having good ability to transfer and deliver oxygen to target tissues, i.e., the VO2 max test, which I'll be doing in 2 weeks' time from now. Um,
Have you
that's
done
going
that
to be an
before
important.
or?
Nah, this is going to be I mean, this will be the first time I'm doing it in a proper like clinical setting. I've reached out to Swinburne University and I said, "Hey guys, like I've been training really intensely. Would like to like undergo a proper VO2 max test in the clinic."
Mhm.
So they'll basically strap up all these different electrodes and they'll measure my oxygen carrying capacity. And my goal with that is to beat 65. like a VO2 max score of 65. That's considered already very good.
Hmm.
Um, the reason I have that number is because a fellow biohacker on YouTube, Simland, he's like really well known in Europe as like a big biohacker in Europe. His score was 65, and he's about the same age as me. So I'm like, and he's also competing in the longevity Olympics at the moment, run by like Brian Johnson,
Ryan Johnson, yeah.
um, the anti-aging
The guy
Olympics.
that doesn't want to die ever.
Yeah, yeah. His book's called Don't Die.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, in terms of going back to the like sort of Peter Attia, that question you asked me, muscle mass is crucial, and also VO2 max is going to be crucial for that. Where does Ozempic fit into the picture? Well, if you're calorically underfed, like as in you're not eating enough due to severe appetite suppression, then building new muscle tissue is not, it's not like it is doable, but it's very difficult. The body doesn't prioritize building muscle when you're in a severe caloric deficit. It just does not do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that you kind of touched on there was with respect to longevity. There's numerous studies that show that as you become older, one of the biggest causes of death is falling over. And
Mm,
people who lack that muscle mass are far more likely to fall over, fracture a bone, and it's essentially the biggest cause of accidental death, falling
mm.
amongst people aged over 65. So the best way to counter that is by maintaining that muscle mass. And as you know, no doubt know, once we turn 30, we lose a small percentage of muscle mass each and every year, unless, of course, we hit the gym and work at maintaining it.
And then also looking at like how testosterone links into the picture here, like
Hmm.
building muscle is going to come from like having adequate testosterone. So if you're not eating enough, your body is not prioritizing testosterone production as well.
Yeah.
So there's a pretty good chance that you're also going to become more infertile, and you're not going to produce as much testosterone when you're in a caloric
Yeah.
deficit.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll just get into malnutrition in a moment, but one other point on muscle loss, I think Eli Lilly, they manufacture Monjaro, which is basically another trade name for an Ozempic type drug, so semaglutide, GLP-1 agonist. They're essentially testing giving people semaglutide in combination with a drug that preserves muscle mass as you lose weight. So of course that's not in the market at the moment. It's in very early testing, I think phase one. But hopefully that's something that could potentially counteract the muscle loss issue. However, that doesn't really help us when it comes to malnutrition. So you kind of touched on that a moment ago. If you're not eating because your appetite's completely suppressed, maybe you're only getting 1,000 calories a day, maybe a couple of bread rolls are sustaining you. Like you're missing out on a whole bunch of like vital things. Like what are we missing out on
Yep.
potentially when our appetite's suppressed?
Well, the most important factor here is like having consideration for these micronutrients and minerals. So
Hmm.
things like zinc, iron, selenium, magnesium, copper, chromium, all of these different minerals are going to be absolutely essential for not only energy, like actually having enough energy to get through your day, but also like reducing your risk of various diseases. So if you actually have a severe deficiency in some of these minerals, you're actually going to increase your risk of other types of diseases. So being in a state where you're actually not consuming an adequate amount of these minerals, these trace elements, you're actually going to be, affecting other things like mental health,
Hmm.
sleep quality, hormones, digestion. These minerals go so far beyond just like, oh, like you better make sure you hit your adequate intake of magnesium just because. It's
Yeah.
not just because, it's because it's like you need it for a reason.
Yeah. So I guess it's I draw parallels between hopping on Ozempic and vegans don't hate me, but like a vegan diet where if you've just come off a pretty, omni herb diet where you're eating meats and whatnot, and then you've switched to vegan, unless you're very um intentional about supplementing, you're probably going to find you're lacking certain micronutrients if you just switch to just eating, say, vegetables and fruits and not much else, and maybe, legumes.
That's definitely a crucial point as well, because then we can sort of go back to the question, which of these foods are going to have the highest bioavailability, which basically means if you compare the protein from, let's say, a can of chickpeas, which typically most people would say it's just full of fiber, but there is a little bit of protein in chickpeas as well. Um, let's say there's in one can, I think it's like, I don't know, like 15 grams of protein.
Hmm.
Let's just call it, versus 15 grams of protein coming from whey protein. Um, there's something called the bioavailability, how the body actually extracts and utilizes the protein.
Yeah.
You're going to get a much better uptake and absorption and utilization from the whey protein, for example, versus the chickpeas. Same goes for like eggs, steak, chicken.
Hmm.
Usually, it's true that animal protein is better utilized. Like the body can utilize the protein more efficiently from animal-based sources versus plant-based sources.
Yeah. Okay. And generally, when people are consuming, say, protein sources that are, say, in liquid form or a powder form, like the body tends to process that, much faster than something that comes in, say, a solid, like a steak, right?
Yeah, so this is a good point. So what happens is if we were to compare eating a piece of steak versus having a protein shake, you're going to get protein, obviously, from both of them. But what's happening is when you're eating a piece of steak, there's something called the thermic effect of food,
Hmm.
which means that your body actually has to really, like, it basically burns calories in the process of digesting the steak. So even though the steak, let's say the steak's 800 calories, your body is actually burning up calories in order to break down and digest that food. Whereas if you look at a protein shake, you don't get as much of a thermic effect. Um, and in addition to that, a protein shake versus a piece of steak has heaps of other minerals and vitamins and other nutrients that a protein shake typically lacks.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, I personally think that um, I'd much rather go for like red meat over a protein shake. But you can see where if somebody has to aim for 200 grams of protein per day,
Mm.
sometimes it can be a bit of a pain in the ass to try and hit that through diet alone.
Yeah. And so with that thermic effect, so with protein, especially something like a steak or a chicken breast, like we burn something like 40% of the calories just in digestion. Whereas with carbs and fats, from what I understand, it's about 10%, right? So this
Mm.
probably has something to do with why when you perhaps eat a little bit too much meat for dinner, you end up having the sweats later that evening when you're in bed because your body's working overtime to try and digest and burn through all that protein.
Yeah, that's like a great, like a typical example of what can happen if you sort of go pretty heavy on the protein. Fish in particular, seafood,
Hmm.
can actually, because of the omega-3s that are found in seafood. I'm not sure if there's any literature to support this, but I feel like subjectively, my body temperature increases a lot more from seafood than from red meat.
That's interesting. Mine increases from red wine. Um, so moving on, actually, maybe I'll just quick side note on the post-workout protein consumption. So given the
Yep.
whey protein doesn't have that thermic effect, gets processed faster, typically one would get more benefit in terms of muscle repair by drinking the whey protein over having that piece of steak.
Uh, if you're having the equivalent amount of protein in the steak versus the whey protein shake,
Hmm.
I wouldn't say that, like, let's say two individuals have the exact same training program and they weigh, let's say twins. Let's pretend we're doing a twin study.
Yep.
Twins, one decides to have a steak after a workout and the other decides to have a protein shake after a workout. Which one's going to build more muscle? Uh, well, to answer that, I would actually say that it actually should be comparable in terms of the effect.
Hmm.
What's good about the protein shake though is that it can it can also lead to a pretty big insulin spike post-workout, and insulin then goes on to release IGF-1, and that can increase. It's like highly anti-catabolic. And I also want to dispel a myth because this will be a bit of a surprise to some of the audience. There's a bro science. Have you heard the bro science myth of you can only absorb 30 grams of protein in one sitting, in one serve?
I have heard this, and I chose not to believe it when I read it.
So the answer to that is actually it's not true. It's not true. You can absorb more than 30. You can utilize more than 30 grams of protein in one serving.
Hmm.
There was a study that was looking at 100 grams of protein in one serve. It's titled "The Anabolic Response to Protein Ingestion During Recovery from Exercise Has No Upper Limit in Magnitude and Duration in Humans." So
Hmm.
this was a study that was released in December 2023, and everyone was talking about it because it just flew in the face of all the bro science guys saying, like, don't have two scoops, bro. Like, it's too much protein.
Yeah.
Um, it's not true.
Well, it's good to know that I've been wasting all that money on, chicken breasts and
Yeah.
whatnot, and smashing 500 grams of chicken for dinner, thinking it's actually working for me when it wasn't. But now I'm back on team no upper limit to protein consumption. So let's keep rocking that train. I wanted to touch on a couple of other risks while I've got you, Lucas, which was one in particular on thyroid cancer.
Mm,
So apparently, Ozempic can increase one's risk of thyroid cancer by about 50%. And the risk factor is actually much higher for people that have a family history of thyroid cancer. Do you know much
mm.
about this?
So there is some, concerns that have been raised about like the potential risk between Ozempic and like thyroid cancer, particularly this type of thyroid cancer called medullary thyroid carcinoma. Now, the exact like risk in humans is not well established.
Hmm.
There's obviously some potential concern around that. The rodent studies, what they do, obviously, they test in animal studies first to identify the risk, and then they want to basically see whether or not it will translate into humans. Um, like the FDA, like they have to state this risk, like it has to be defined.
Hmm.
Um, so in terms of if an individual has a family history of thyroid cancer, then it may not be the right medicine for you to take that risk. It may not be.
Yeah, the risks might outweigh the benefits in that case, and you might be better off just doing it the old-fashioned way and trying to, manage that diet and exercise. And I mean, just on that topic, diet and exercise, in which circumstances, Lucas, might that not actually be enough for people? Because, it's easy for someone in the, bro science or biohacking community to say, just get off your ass, don't jab yourself with this needle, work out, eat well, have some discipline. But that's just not the case for a lot of people. So, under what circumstances might someone, not really get the benefits that they're desiring from exercising and working out, insofar as weight loss is concerned? Because no doubt there's all sorts of other benefits that one gets from working out, especially when it comes to mental health and confidence and feeling good about yourself and so on.
Well, I think a certain element of weight loss that's oftentimes neglected is like the an underlying hypothyroid case or condition where it's like no one. So what happens is you go to your doctor and you ask the doctor to do a general test for your thyroid, and most of the time the doctor will test something called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, but it's not actually a true. If you're not trained to understand how to read blood test results, and funnily enough, a lot of doctors really suck at, like, no offense to doctors, like there are many great doctors out there, but a lot of them actually don't know how to interpret a thyroid panel because they're not actually testing T4 and T3.
Hmm.
T4 and T3 are the actual thyroid hormones. TSH is checked, it just measures what the brain is sending the signal to your thyroid gland. And a patient will be super confused Because if their TSH is actually high, they'll be like, oh, geez, maybe my thyroid is high. My score came back as high. My thyroid must be high. It's actually false. If your score is high, it actually means your metabolism is slow.
Hmm.
And this is something that probably the biggest like issue in medicine, in my opinion, at the moment when it comes to sort of fat loss.
Yeah. So, I mean, people with thyroid issues is one. Are there any other sort of categories of people that perhaps struggle to lose weight the old-fashioned way through diet and exercise?
Somebody has like something called Cushing's disease, which is like an absurd amount of cortisol. Like they're just constantly producing cortisol. That's one.
And I hear people
Um,
with Cushing's disease are like ravenous, like you just want to eat all the time. Is that right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That can definitely be one. Maybe some like sort of, I don't know, muscle wastage diseases where like something called like sarcopenia.
Hmm.
There's conditions where like muscle wastage could be an issue as well.
Yeah. Interesting. Um, so we've talked a lot about sort of the physiological benefits and risks of Ozempic and semaglutide, but one thing that people are starting to talk about is some of the psychological consequences of taking this. And there are a few, but one in particular that's causing anxiety, depression, and in some cases, suicidal ideation is just this fact that people have a bit of a dependency on food. Like it's comfort food. So if life's not going well, what do you do without even thinking about it? Get onto Uber Eats, go to the cupboard, gorge your face, and feel better about things for about 10 minutes. But when people who perhaps have been relying on food as a crutch for years, if not decades, suddenly have no appetite, that can leave a gaping hole. And it's forcing people to then experience all these sort of negative consequences because they're not filling that hole with anything else. Like, what are you
Mm.
seeing in so far as the psychological consequences of Ozempic are concerned?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, a number of people like when they leverage food, they're using it as a like as a rewarding or a coping mechanism to soothe pain or as an emotional comfort, that sort of thing. Why? Well, because it's easy. It's very easy to just go to your local supermarket and just get something tasty. Um, it's just ubiquitous, so it's going to be
Mm,
really easy for people to use them. Um, I think one thing that's really important to consider when we're looking at patients that are on the verge of going onto Ozempic is have they like potentially looked into the reasons why they're using food as a coping mechanism? Is there an underlying like trauma or some sort of issue in their life that they're not really addressing head on? And that really involves like actually working with a psychologist or a counselor that actually can help to identify that
yep.
and build that self-awareness, because sometimes all it takes is just having that self-awareness and just catching it just that split second before the person takes action.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the surface level solution, the band-aid is okay, just replace that hole that you used to fill with food with something else. Like it could be a creative pursuit, it could be um, watching TV. Not that that's that much healthier, different sort of consequences, but underlying all of this really is the more important stuff. It's like, well, what's that sort of feeling that you used to run away from coming from? Like, why do you feel that anxiety? And if it's recurring, then it's not something that happened that day. It's something deeper in your life, which maybe it's current set of circumstances, which is maybe a lack of a relationship, maybe your finances are screwed, maybe you hate your job and you hate your boss, or maybe it's something far deeper from, say, childhood, some sort of trauma that's causing you to feel this way. And that's something that you really need to address. So, in some cases, while it might be paradoxical, jumping on Ozempic and feeling these things and not knowing what to do about it could be a healthy trigger to then actually solve these underlying issues as opposed to gorge your face with Doritos.
That's actually a pretty good point. I think you could do a combination of both therapies at once. It would be like the individual goes on Ozempic at the same time they're actually seeking out like counseling or nutritional advice, like guidance and whatnot. But then also being smart about like if they can't control their like sweet tooth or their cravings, man, there's so many different foods that they can eat that shouldn't really lead to any, major health consequences. Like if we're overeating protein, for example, I know it's not sweet, but you can find a way to make protein sweet.
Yeah.
Like there is a way. You can use different sort of sweeteners, things like that. Um, if you overeat on protein, you're less likely to gain weight versus if you overeat on carbs or fats.
Yeah. I tend to snack on pumpkin seeds late at night. If I just feel like consuming something, I have a handful of pumpkin seeds, maybe two. And probably not the best thing in the world, but compared to say a donut or a bag of Doritos, the impact is basically negligible. So
Man, I don't know. I don't know. I think pumpkin seeds, in my opinion, are completely fine. You can
yeah,
just smash them with zero consequences.
smash half a kilo of pumpkin seeds. Um, so I guess over the last few years, Lucas, we have seen, I mean, this goes back to probably probably the noughties. Like there was that TV show, How to Look Good Naked, which essentially got people of all shapes and sizes and, dressed them up and gave them manicures and did their hair and made them look good regardless of what their body type was, what their BMI was. And since then, we've seen this whole healthy at any size movement emerge. We've seen the likes of, pop stars like Lizzo celebrate being a big girl, essentially. Adele for a little while was, overweight pop star, but she did lose that weight, which in her case got a lot of her fans angry because her fans who could relate to her being overweight suddenly felt betrayed. A lot of people in this movement suggest that, it doesn't matter what weight you are, you can still be healthy. Are they right? Or, I mean, is there no running from, diabetes and heart disease and things like, bad hips and bad knees and whatnot if you are, say, 20% or more heavier than what you should be?
Yeah, look, there's definitely going to be a certain, like, there's going to be a range in which once you cross that certain threshold and you're actually stacking on the pounds and kilograms, like, you're definitely not healthy. Like, I know there's this
Body
what is it?
positivity.
Body positivity movement. Look, there's going to be individuals that are genetically going to be a little bit bigger than other people, but I think it hits a certain point threshold where it's like if you're carrying many, many, many extra kilos and your BMI is like way higher than what it should be, um, you're increasing your risk for various diseases. And there's no arguing with that. It's a medical fact that being fat is not healthy. Like it's just not. Um, and like whilst people try, there was a doctor from the UK who posted, and I actually did a video review to this, is like she was stating that there's no medical issue with being overweight, like as in there's no consequence in terms of health. But like if you study biology as a naturopath that I am and studying biohacking and biology, like your hormonal profile when you're obese is not good. Like
Yeah.
it's just not good.
Yeah. So I guess that this whole movement might make you feel good in the short term, but like anything, if you bury your head in the sand long enough and ignore any sort of negative influences in your life, whether it's your weight, whether it's a toxic relationship, whether it's dwindling finances, like the long-term implications are going to be potentially, fatal in this case.
Exactly. Yeah, no,
Mm.
it's definitely needs to be considered.
Yeah. So, I mean, Ozempic's not the first of these sort of wonder drugs or magic pills that we've seen flood the market. Like back in the early 90s, there was a drug called fen, which was manufactured by Wyeth, later acquired by Pfizer. And this particular drug caused two serious problems, one of which was primary pulmonary hypertension. It also caused heart defects. Now, interestingly, in this case, some of the people at the manufacturer were quoted as saying that they knew about this, but quote unquote, if we tell what we know, that will really bring doctors' attention to the risk of primary pulmonary hypertension. It's going to have an effect on the bottom line. So
Mm.
it sounds like even if there are a lot of negative consequences and side effects, the potential market for this drug is huge. And the incentive for manufacturers like Novo Nordisk, who makes Ozempic, to kind of do what the food lobby did back in the 60s and 70s with fat, kind of bend the truth and amplify the benefits while kind of playing down some of the risks.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I mean, there's definitely a lot of money to be made from the fat loss market, and
Mm,
big pharma's smart because they know if they can create a drug where people are reliant upon it in order to quench their appetite, like you're in for success, and like they probably made millions and millions of dollars from this particular drug, and it's always sold out. Like it's always like out of stock or difficult for people to get their hands on. And now they're realizing that, oh, well, maybe we can stack it. Typical scenario of like polypharmacy, where they're like, oh, let's create another drug that offsets the muscle wastage side effects. So it's like,
yeah.
let's combine it with something else that prevents that. Um, like, I think what's happening is a lot of these celebrities are endorsing these or openly admitting that they're using these particular medications, and a lot of like women that watch these entertainment shows and things like that, they're gonna be curious about the drugs, and they're gonna ask their doctor about it, and of course their doctor is very unlikely to resist that. They're gonna be
Mhm.
like, okay, here you go. And then that's where the issues arise when like they're like pretty much like selecting a drug that they're potentially going to be on for the rest of their life because it's so hard to come off it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have seen. I mean, initially, Ozempic was purely for diabetic patients, but nowadays, like there is Wegovy, which is an alternative that is made for just the mass market people who just want to lose weight, even if they're at a relatively healthy weight, but they want to lose an extra 5 kilos maybe. And so it is being marketed. And I think I saw some statistics saying that the market for Ozempic and similar drugs will be worth something like 200 billion US dollars by the end of the decade. So it's definitely in their interest to tell a very positive narrative, to spin a very positive narrative when it comes to these drugs. I guess a less positive and narrative that one might spin about the broader sort of world we live in, especially in the West, is the one around mindset. Like it seems
Mm.
like there is this tendency to look for the quick fix in our society, to take the path of least effort, to press a button on Uber Eats, to chill out and just watch Netflix. Like our society has made it's basically built around convenience. Like if you're building a business, the business that makes it much easier for you to buy their product and consume what they're giving you typically wins. So convenience is basically one of the primary indicators of how people will behave. And in this case, I could go to the gym, I could eat well, I could be on a meal plan. It might take me 3 to 6 months to start seeing results, or I could just jab myself in the stomach with Ozempic. But if we rely so much on these quick fixes, it's like that saying, how I do anything is how I do everything. I make my bed in the morning. Um, Therefore, I start my day on the right foot, go to the gym in the morning, do all these things. And then, therefore, you're going to approach your day with a lot more agency and a lot more ownership and a lot more discipline. Like, do you think that stuff like Ozempic and reliance on drugs like Ozempic is just going to feed into this and just, I don't know, maybe I'm being dramatic, but just create a very lazy population that just always looks for the easy way out and isn't willing to do the hard work required to get awesome goals or benefits or outcomes, whether it's with your health or whether it's with the business or whether it's with a relationship.
Well, you've spoken about this numerous times, Steve, which is like humans are always going to choose the path of least resistance, and
Hmm.
that's going to come with consequences. And I think an important point to emphasize here is that there are ways to like mimic the effects of Ozempic without actually using the drug. Like there are ways to actually, like there are new ingredients that have come out that are orally active, like supplements that can increase GLP-1 by up to 600%. I was literally on a call with a company last week called CaloCurb, CALOCURB.com. They've spent over $30 million in research on their particular ingredient, and it has been shown to increase GLP-1, which is the appetite suppressant
Mhm.
hormone, in humans by up to 600%. So, and that's not going to come with the same sort of like really bad side effect profile. Um, and it's better, it's naturally occurring as well, which means it's better handled by the body.
Yeah.
And then there's also different foods that can increase GLP-1. Like
Yeah.
there's avocados have been shown to do that, things like that.
Yeah. So I think in that case, if one wants to get some of these benefits without taking the absolute easy road, like perhaps looking for foods that can mimic some of these benefits, obviously it's not going to be at the same scale, but it
No.
will help to suppress your appetite. Like avocado, definitely. Like I'm a big
Yep.
avocado junkie, and if I smash a whole avocado, like I'm good. Like
Yeah.
any sort of appetite or craving, basically tapers off and I'm good for a few hours. So just pairing
Mm.
your foods with some of those sort of appetite suppressants, I think, can be very useful. Speaking of appetite suppressing, I suppose looking at Japan, people in Japan, particularly regions like Okinawa, it's a blue zone. People live longer than most places in the world. I mean, there's a few of these blue zones, like Ikaria in Greece, Loma Linda in California, Okinawa in Japan, where people live on average to about 85 years old. But it's not only that they live a long life, it's that their health span is really long. So they don't really start to record sort of negative health factors until they're about 79, 80. So about 5, 6 years before the time of death. Whereas in Western societies, people go downhill from like 65, like 20 years, 15 to 20 years before they pass away. And in Japan, something like less than 5% of people are obese. So at the start of the conversation, I mentioned in the USA, it's about 42%. So we're talking about a factor of 10 times less people being overweight, actually being obese, not just overweight. What can we learn from the Japanese, Lucas, insofar as diet is concerned?
I mean, that's a good question. Like if we were to compare the different types of foods that they consume versus like, the typical Western diet, an American, what we call, they call it the standard American diet. I call it this, yeah, it's a sad diet. Um,
Yeah.
very likely to make you more depressed.
Full of trans
Um,
fats.
yep. Is like, yeah, we're going to see a massive, like disproportionate amount of these fat, like trans fats, refined processed foods, highly palatable foods versus the Japanese diet is generally, seafood. They're pretty big on seafood,
Mhm.
sashimi, things like that. They don't have they don't have a big amount of carbohydrates. They just keep it pretty like clean with just like simple white rice or brown rice, some noodles, things like that. Easy to digest, sweet potatoes, things like that.
A lot of fermented foods as well, like kimchi and pickles and stuff, which is good
Yeah,
for your gut.
yeah. Well, those foods are also the foods that increase satiety, as like because they work on your gut bugs. They kill off, candida and things like that. So it's going to keep you satiated. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of factors there. Also, I feel like their serving sizes aren't as big as well.
Yeah, I think their serving sizes are smaller, but it's based on the nature of the food they're eating, like you said, that just makes you fuller faster. And one thing that Japanese people tend to do is eat or stop eating rather when they're 80% full. Whereas in the
Mm.
West, it tends to be stop eating when you're 120% full. Like eat so fast that your brain hasn't got time to catch up and signal to you that you're actually full, right? Whereas the Japanese will eat slowly, and they'll eat types of foods that before you're done eating, you're like, okay, I'm good. And then based on the nature of the food, you feel fuller for longer. And it's funny because like I've been to numerous like sushi restaurants and Japanese restaurants over the years where I look at the plate, I'm like, man, this is nothing. I'm gonna have to go home and eat again. But then I'll eat, whether it's a kimchi and some rice and some seaweed, some small pieces of fish. But for whatever reason, that combination of food, suddenly an hour later, I'm like, man, I'm full. Like I didn't feel like I didn't look like there was a lot of food on my plate, but for whatever reason, definitely keeps me satiated.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. I think another factor there is like the pace in which humans consume food can heavily impact how quickly they get full. So like actually putting your damn cutlery down is important. And
Hmm.
it's something that I've only just noticed that I don't do at all. Like personally, like I rarely put the cutlery down and actually listen to the person talking or, actually like pause and sit and
Right.
actually, I think that's a big factor. Like just forgetting to just take breaks when you eat. Because if you like, I feel like there's like a running scarcity like
Mm.
mindset around foods like oh shit like I want to just get as much into my body as possible but there usually isn't a scarcity factor for most people.
Yeah, I think that's probably just an evolutionary holdover from when we, could go days without eating on the African savannah tens of thousands of years ago. And so when you did find food, a tree of berries or whatever it was, you were just like, gorge yourself because you didn't know when you were going to eat again, and you'd want to hold on to that food as energy to get you through the next few days. Whereas,
Mm,
we've got supermarkets on every corner, Uber Eats in our pocket. Your fridge is probably full, and so that scarcity, while it might be a holdover, it's just not a reflection of reality today for most
mm,
people. So taking the time to eat slowly and also taking the time to actually appreciate your food and the taste palette and everything else. Like sometimes I'll do this thing where as a gratitude exercise, I don't do it often, maybe once a month, but I should do it more often, where I'll look at the different foods on my plate and take stock of where they've come from. So if I have berries, chances are they're from Chile, right? Some farmer in Chile has gone through this process to cultivate these crops of berries, and somehow they've, gone through that process. They've been packed and put on a plane and come over to Australia. Like that alone makes me appreciate those berries so much more. And you can tell the same story about, the avocado, the chicken, the eggs, where did they come from? Like, and the story behind how they got from where they started to your plate. And then consuming that makes you like so much more appreciative of the food on your plate. Whereas so many of us can just sit down, eat, kind of like driving a car. You get from destination A to B without even realizing the journey. And it can be the same with eating. Suddenly your plate's empty and you don't even remember a single bite you had because you just like wolfed it down while doing three other things and maybe looking at your phone at the same time.
yeah, that's the I guess like it's the productivity culture that we're in where we just want to like eat as much as we can whilst we're like whilst we're working on doing our work, responding to emails, taking calls, eat.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense why people do that.
Yeah, nuts. Well, Lucas, this has been a fascinating conversation, a bit of an inch deep, mile wide conversation on all things Ozempic and semaglutides. If people want to learn more about you, they can head over to boostyourbiology.com. If they want to learn about boosting their testosterone, which we did touch on earlier in this conversation, you've got a course available online. What can you tell us about that real quick?
Yep, so they can check out trtfree.com. It's the single best resource online to boost testosterone levels naturally for any guy looking to optimize that. So they can check that out. And also, yeah, the YouTube channel Boost Your Biology. There's hundreds of highly informative educational videos there. So go over there and yeah, check it out.
Yep, Boost Your Biology. You've got a podcast by the name of Boost Your Biology, and you're also quite active on Instagram at handle.
Ergogenic Health, ERGOGENIC_health.
Beautiful. Well, we'll add all of those to the show notes for our listeners. Lucas, thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to our conversation number 4 in a couple of years.
Absolutely. Sounds good, man. Thanks for having me.